101, take one.
Again, thank you for having us. This is really exciting for me. Can we start with just telling us, how did you first meet Dr. King and what were your first impressions?
You know, the first meeting was really indirect. I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, and most of our people had adjusted to the situation. Ministers reinforced the adjustment. Be good people, but don't fight for change, don't fight for power, because it met with such stiff resistance. So to see Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and Reverend Shuttlesworth emerge as redefining the role of ministers was itself a source of relief. So we met them there. We began to follow them in that vein. I was arrested July 1960 with several classmates trying to use a public library. Little did I know he was aware of that. And then in '63 in Greensboro, North Carolina, at North Carolina A&T, we were involved in a major sit-in movement there. So when I first met him physically, I was coming to Atlanta to speak at Morehouse as a member of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. And he was coming to the airport with his group only to get his Nobel Prize. It was just a thrill to see him. He saw me, he called my name, Jesse. It threw me off. Hi, it's Sam. He was talking about Dr. Sam Proctor, who he knew at Boston University, and they were good friends. He began how things going in Greensboro, how things at A&T, how things at Bennett. So the fact that he was, because we had been on television quite a bit during that time, during the Greensboro struggle. So I met him in that sense. To me, it depicted how sensitive he was, how aware he was of our struggle. I remember Ernie Green talking about when they graduated from Little Rock Central, he was at the graduation. Not as a speaker, he was just there at the graduation. He was deeply immersed in the Southern struggle to end apartheid in the South. I remember the first time I was real close. We were in Selma, and Reverend C.T. Vivian and I went by Miss Boynton's house where he was staying. He was lying in bed. He had by him Love, Power, and Justice by Paul Tillich, The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich, Nature and Destiny of Man by Niebuhr, and the Bible. I asked him about the books because I was in seminary at the time. He said, well, I read one fiction, one nonfiction book a week. He was deeply scholarly. As I often say to young people who catch on to I have their dream dimension of his life, Dr. King finished high school at 15. He finished Morehouse at 19. He finished seminary at 22, his PhD at 26. Deeply committed to scholarship. He knew the strong minds break strong chains. I always hear young people say, now, when did he become radical? To be in Montgomery, Alabama, a block from the Confederate Capitol and from the Confederate White House, and to call a boycott to dislocate that city in the South was a very radical move. When Rosa Parks was arrested, the bus driver was legally right. Ms. Parks was morally right. There was a sign above the driver's head that read, colored seat from the rear, whites from the front. Those who violate by law will be punished. And so to defy that law was radical. And there was someone who said, well, now that she has, the bus company wants to apologize, he said, no, until the sign comes down, until the wall comes down, nothing has happened. He saw beyond private pain to the issue of social justice. And it was significant. I asked Mrs. Parks one day to show how connected things are. I said, Mrs. Parks, why didn't you go to the back of the bus, given the fact that, everybody else did, or if you stayed up there, you could be arrested, or you could be run over by the bus or something, beat by hostile forces. She said, I thought about going back, but I thought about Emmett Till. I couldn't go back. August 20th, 1955, Emmett Till was lynched. All that stuff was happening at the same time. So in the midst of lynching and very barbaric activity and hostile laws, he emerges out of that cauldron, calling for an unusual thing for the South, and the end to Confederate rule, a demand for social justice, a demand for one set of rules. So even, we must not underestimate just how militant the Montgomery bus boycott was as an action, a collective action that lasted for a year. And then not only did the action survive, but the law. Mrs. Parks and Reverend Dr. Attorney Fred Gray were testing the law of 54 to see if it were valid, the 54 Supreme Court decision. So she didn't just happen to sit down. She meant to sit down. She was willing to go to jail. It was a plan to bail her out. But those were very militant actions. And so every action he made for change had a certain edge of not adjustment, not resentment, but resistance and change.
As you got to know him personally, what surprised you about him as a person?
Well, just his energy level and his reading habits and his willingness to open up to other people, to staff members, and to let ideas flow. Will you agree with him or disagree? Or something he would just point blank, what do you see? His willingness to a kind of participatory democracy. He had a point of view, he had a conclusion, but that feature of him and his preparation, he usually spent Tuesday was kind of his off day. He spent Tuesday studying, reflecting upon what happened the last week and projecting. But he was quite sociable. I mean, he laughed a lot, with friends. What we call preacher jokes. So he was once a very personable guy. Many activists don't have much analysis. Many analysts don't have much action. He had the combination of action and analysis and preparation. He would say you must not have the paralysis of analysis. You can't just keep on talking. You have to act. But if you act without analysis, you don't know where you're going. And if you you see it, but you don't act, you can't get there. So he saw the combination that led to power, and that power led to change. There is a new South today, and there's in many ways a new America because Dr. King led the movement to pull down those walls. You could not have the Carolina Panthers and Atlanta Falcons. They couldn't have existed behind the cotton curtain because it would have been illegal for them to play together, stay together, sit in the fans together, in the stands together. You couldn't have had the Olympics in Atlanta behind the cotton curtain. South Carolina would not be the #1 producer of tires in America today behind the cotton curtain. You wouldn't have Honda and Nissan and Toyota in the South behind the cotton curtain today. You couldn't have had Clemson playing Alabama, black quarterbacks in the South behind the cotton curtain. So in many ways, the whole South must attribute its growth and its removal of certain barriers, not to any Southern governor or any Southern senator. All that was in Dr. King's watch. It's important to note that we not take for granted those changes, but the South as we knew it was not always as it is today. And then did it free black people. It freed so many white people. Jimmy Carter couldn't have come from Plains, Georgia, and gone to the White House behind the cotton curtain. George Bush couldn't have come from Odessa, Texas, to the White House behind the cotton curtain. Bill Clinton from Hope, Arkansas. Because so long as the curtain was there and the South was in the shadows, it was assumed that any Southerner was too racist, quote unquote, to lead the country. So Southern whites were in some sense regionalized and limited as well. When the curtain came down, the wall and the bridge went up, it shed light on everybody. It's like the right to vote. Blacks have been denied the protected right to vote from states' rights since 1880. Well, white women couldn't serve on juries since 1967. 18-year-olds couldn't vote, those serving in Vietnam. You couldn't vote on campuses. You couldn't vote bilingually. You couldn't get proportionality in delegate selection for conventions. All that stuff happens in the wake of the flood of Dr. King's sense of social justice and redemption.
Absolutely. You'd mentioned briefly about these preacher jokes. Do you remember any, or can you give us a feel for what it was like and the competitive nature of preachers when they get together?
I never sensed the competition, but guys just have fun as they express. Some ministers are could be comedians because they're public speakers and they develop punchlines to tell their stories. I don't remember this frankly specifically about him, but he was easier to laugh and go along with friends in favor.
He refers to his staff as a team of wild horses. There are a lot of strong personalities there. Can you talk about that and how his management style, how did he corral all you wild horses?
Jose was strong. Jose would go into a fire with gasoline clothes on. He was that kind of defiant figure and sometimes boisterous. And we didn't know what Dr. King knew. I remember sometimes he would drink, but he was such a good guy. We all gravitated to him. When Jose was 15, put his age up to go to the war. His mother and father were blind. They'd never seen each other, and they'd never seen their children. And while in the war, he was in a foxhole. I think 7 or 8 people were killed. He survived. It affected how his sense of survival, his sense of justice. So he had that strong kind of something about him. Bevel was just creative. I mean, he would take any kind of risk. But Bevel could just like see things unfolding for him. He could just like, he could go to the point. And it was always so smart. Administrative type, a great balancing wheel. Reverend Abernathy was the rock that we all leaned on when things got rough. Dorothy Cotton was head of our political education, or voter education department it's called. So all these different, Reverend C.T. Vivian, the kind of theologian in the house. Bernard Lafayette, the nonviolent artist, really, theoretician and activist. So we would have the right to argue and take positions. And he would say 2 things. One, that we were a team of wild horses, and it was his job to take that energy and direct it. And sometime when the stuff would get hot on the inside of a stabbing, he would say, well, we reflect in here what's out there. We cannot corral ourselves, we cannot corral the community. And so he saw that in some perspective. The other thing he would say that he was the pilot of the plane, but we were the ground crew. Without the ground crew, the plane cannot go from port to port, from arrival to departure. It cannot have the mechanical dimensions. So he had an appreciation of the field crew. Because after all, the Sunday of the big march in Selma, Alabama, he was in his church preaching that morning. But James Orange, along with Bevel and along with John Lewis and Jose Williams, Cotton Reader, the field crew was on the ground. So he had a great appreciation of the many roles that many people play. And he saw himself as kind of guiding those forces. And he was more interested in building a kind of a tugboat as opposed to an ocean liner. He didn't want a big organization per se. He didn't want a membership organization so he could get bogged down and raise the members. It was not the big ocean liner. He wanted to have a strike force that go into a given town and raise the issues, expose the contradictions, and had the courage to fight. And so I remember him telling me one time that he did not want to build a big building and leave it as a monument. Didn't want to have a lot of money left. He felt if any money were left, it would be a reflection on his leadership. That it was not about money. He believed that you should be materialistically minded enough to take care of basic essentials, but not mindless and materialistic and out for your stuff. He had that sense of his value. That's why when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he gave money away to all other organizations, kept just a proportion for SCLC, because those were kind of his values.
I'd like to move to talk about coming up to Chicago. So after Selma, this move to Chicago, and the housing the move to end slums and him moving up to Chicago. Can you talk about that and how did the movement change when it moved up here to Chicago and your role in that?
Well, when he came to Chicago, first of all, there was a big debate, should we leave the South Jose thought we never should have left the South. There was so much unfinished business in the South. That was his point of view. And I thought perhaps we should go to New York because there was a certain infrastructure relationships in New York to prove we could go urban. And Bevel came to Chicago, and Reverend C.T. Vivian came to Chicago with the Urban Training Center. Bernard Lafayette came to Chicago. But Chicago had an organization called the Triple CO, Chicago Coordinating Council of Community Organizations. He felt that the infrastructure would give us a right platform. There's always a challenge. Nonviolence work in the South and nonviolence work in the North. Violence is subtle in the North and it's very overt in the South. All these dynamics of suppressed to come north, so he came to Chicago. He came with the focus on schools, overcrowded schools, and the lack of resources for those schools. We call them Willis wagons, overcrowded black schools, segregated schools, I might add. Children going to classes in the trailers. So while that was going on, he said to the ministers, well, you guys to work on something called breadbasket. Look at these companies that sell us milk and bread and product, but don't hire us to drive trucks. You go to the stores, there were no black working in the meat departments, produce managers, checkout clerks, not putting money in banks on the weekend to make money. It was just stone economic occupation. So ministers became fascinated with the bread basket part of things. I had begun to organize ministers, and he later made me national director of Operation Breadbasket. Well, while we were working on Breadbasket and he was going to deal with the schools thing, on the west side, Belleville and Bernard Lafayette were getting children who would, put urine in bottles and take them downtown and find lead in the urine. And so you had the whole slums where the absentee landlords had the product, had to own the house, but they moved on to Florida. They just sucking money out of it, not reinvesting. So you had these competing forces. One, the breadbasket movement, the ministers. You had the education movement. You had the in the slum movement, union to end the slum. So you organize a whole block, don't pay rent until something happens. And at some time, I'm rather convinced it was Bevel who said, here we are, 25%. Locked on 10% of the land. We got to move out of these slums. We got to demand all territories. So we start marching down 71st Street. Little did we realize, which was Dr. King's real passion, was a mass movement for mass change. And when we began to move west of Halsted, the whites, based on their ignorance and their fear of our motives and what they had been taught, then the whole neighborhoods began to resist us and to run the rocks and all of that. So the mass marches took over, but that's not what became. And Dr. King was right in his bailiwick, mass action, mass reaction, mass change, global view. So you had the school movement in the slums, breadbasket, and open house, so kind of four things were happening at the same time. And in the end, while some skeptics say you lost Chicago, the fact of the matter is, two things happened in Chicago. One thing happened was that the Fair Housing Act of '68 became the Chicago Open Housing Movement. That's as concrete as the public accommodation of the right to vote, to fair housing. The second was Rainbow Push, which here at Dr. King's workshop, we never stopped. Dr. King had said this would not be a 3-month, 6-month movement like a kind of one-horse, small southern town. This was a big, complex Chicago. Out of Chicago has come 4 black congressmen, 3 U.S. senators, state black African-American senators. I ran for president, Barack won for president, all that stuff, because we helped to lead the breakup of the mentally incarcerated blacks in this city and unleash that power. So the dynamic, no other city has had the political leadership emerged since '66 in Chicago. You think about Caramel DeBron and Barack Obama and Roland Burris as senators, my run in '84 and '88, out leading the drive to unseat the Daley delegation in Florida in 1972. Bobby Rush, ex-Panthers congressman, and Danny Davis in the Congress, and Jesse Jr. in the Congress, and so you see this whole political, that the independent movement finally prevailed. And I think it's a kind of a dark spot in the mind of historians who see Chicago as a failure. That's a mistake. No city has had the change and inclusion of black people. And then Emil Jones led the drive to get reapportionment. That's where you have a Latino, Gutierrez. So the Black-Brown Coalition is alive in Chicago. Harold Washington ran for mayor against the most tremendous odds, and he won. But you cannot connect Harold's winning in '83 from what happened in '66, because many of the financing of his movement came from the breadbasket beneficiaries. Many of the guys who were the beneficiaries of our economic movement became the officers of Harold Washington's campaign. Al Johnson worked for Harold for $1 a year. Dr. Albute was his treasurer. Al Johnson and George Johnson and John Johnson, all that Chicago. And I associate that very much with Dr. King's work, the kind of radical urban reconstruction movement came from his movement.
Going back to in Chicago, King talks about how surprised he was at the ferocity of the whites. Can you sort of paint a picture of maybe a day or what?
Chicago is a city of ethnic enclaves, 70-some cities within the city, and people fiercely guard their neighborhood turf. And various ethnic groups, European ethnic groups, have certain territories. There's Latinos and blacks and Russians and Germans and all that. So we started marching west of Halsted. They saw us invading their territory. And they had seen blacks in the most stereotypical terms. When we come, pain comes, community disintegration comes, and there was a reaction to us as a people, stereotypes. And so we began to march for the right of open housing. And we would have a black and a white go to rent a house. They would tell the black no rooms available. White come right back and get room available. So we had to break down house by house. And then they had the real estate guys, they what they call block busting. Once a black moved in on the block, till other whites, they're coming and they jack the price. So it really was not just the crowd throwing the rocks, which is obvious. The real estate brokers were behind that deal, and the bankers. Bankers would only lend you money to buy a house or for business in certain areas. So the bankers had a role in this. Their hands were hid. The real estate brokers leading the blockbuster, and they had a role to play in this. So the kids throwing rocks, they may be in the third or fourth layer of resistance. So you had the basic Catholic Church leadership, where most of them were Catholic. And that's why at the end of the day, the Archbishop had to come to the table to preach the immorality of segregation and limiting people based upon race and gender or religion.
And what about King when he moved in with his family to the projects? Were you around?
Yeah, on the west side, he moved into us just to prove when he moved into that apartment, it was to put a focus on the fact that people had to pay rent, didn't have heat, had to pay rent, maybe didn't have running water, had to pay rent, lead paint on the walls. I mean, and so by moving in the middle of the community, put a global focus. In other words, he had the strategic sense to put light in dark places and heat in cold places. He knew that by his corner, it illuminated the situation. You could say, oh man, the people owned it, and one place we moved into, it was kind of painful for us. We moved into one house with a slum landlord who was draining money from there but putting nothing back. He died, which was not associated with our effort nor our intent, but that was just older people who lived in those neighborhoods. And so as the blocks were busted, they would rent to blacks, but not reinvest. That's what made the slum. Because the only difference between a condo and a project is that the condos, people wipe the windows and they take care of the elevators, but and then the so-called projects, you don't have the accompanying facility developer, protector of property.
And personally, was it hard on King or on his family to be living up?
I don't think so, because there was excitement. That was the people were responding in such great numbers. That was the joy of doing. He would say the most difficult part of the movement when you leave the excitement of a march in Selma, where there's even violent reaction. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is that when all that's over, you got to get people to register and vote. They call the slow, non-romantic dimension, when the lights are not there. The hardcore organized, convincing people to change their minds, to change their situation. Because at the end of the day, change comes when people change their minds. Most people who are under occupation, whose backs are against the wall, have three options. And that's why it's so difficult to organize without understanding this. Most people adjust. They've found their place, they've found their space, where they live, where they can live, where they grocery shop, where they go to school, where they go to church, where they get married. They live in the circle, and they've adjusted to, they blank the outside world away. So if you're in the ghetto, now you're paying pension funds, and the pension funds are building the other side of town. They're building the big, tall buildings, but you just forget that. You're living in conditions where you live there, but you don't control the economic resources, but you've adjusted. And some people, beyond, they know better, but they don't feel empowered enough to change anything. So they often become very bitter. They've not adjusted. They resent. And then there's a third dimension called resistance. That's where the action comes in, where where you become maladjusted, as Dr. King would say. And you resent, but you also begin to resist. Resisting means some kind of boycott, some kind of action. The weapons we use, one, the effective use of one's vote, one's dollar, coalition, action, and to be morally right. Those are the weapons that you use. Because at the end of the day, our biggest weapon is to be mostly morally right. Mrs. Parks was mostly right. Those who marched in Birmingham were mostly right. Those who marched for the right to vote were mostly morally right. We couldn't impose wrong on anybody. We had, in fact, to assert the rightness of our cause and the righteousness of our cause, and be willing to suffer and sacrifice to that end. And nonviolence is both a strategy and a way of life. If we had been fighting with arms, we couldn't have battled in arms. But then Dr. King said, if you shoot and you get shot, then there are no winners. But if you can have change without shooting and getting shot, then both can survive for another day. And so now when I go to a game in the South where the Dallas Cowboys play the Houston, Texas, Atlanta, and you see people choosing uniform color over skin color, direction over complexion, that's part of the transformation. And after all, we were enslaved longer than we have been free. We were enslaved for 246 years. We've not been free 246 years. And whites learned to live as slave masters for that long. And after slavery, it was more violent than slavery. After all, 1880 to 1940, 5,000 blacks were lynched. 5,000 without an indictment. Lynching took place after church on Sunday. They really believed blacks were inferior, and it was God-ordained inferiority and God-ordained superiority. So the layers of racial supremacy and racial degradation were much deeper than most people realize. When people learn to believe in their DNA, that they had the right to impose their will on others. But we had an obligation to resist. So the resistance movement, ultimately, our resistance, our distance there, will to occupy. And And on our worst days, we see the backlash, which always comes after the forward move. But also, in addition, you also see these lights of progress. I mean, when I ran in '84, we got the right to vote in '65. We were happy. It was a big deal. We didn't realize that the right to vote, the burden was on us. We didn't know anything about gerrymandering, how to draw lines, annexation, at-large, road purging, ticket splitting. We learned that in the next 25 years. That's how deep that thing was. I ran in '84. We got 3.5 million votes and less than 400 delegates. Delegates did not correspond to the votes. So we figured out something called winner take all. If I get 49 and somebody else get 50.1, they'd take 100%. And so that meant the 49 who worked for me get 0. Other people get 49% they didn't earn, which itself undercut development. So we got some kind of proportionality. If I get 49% of the vote, I get that many delegates. On that theory, and I ran in '88, we got 1,200 delegates. We were learning how the science of politics. On the '84 rules, Hillary won California, Ohio, Pennsylvania, barely, but she won them. On the '84 rules, she would have been the winner in '08. But on the '88 rules, President Barack Obama got his, even though she won California, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, and Texas, he still got his share of delegates, and he won because we democratized democracy. We kept changing. The movement never continued until we finally even the playing field. And as I look at these, why we become so dominant in athletics. And to me, it's the very best analogy. On the field, no one argues about split homes and the social condition you came from. What makes us so dominant in the football field, basketball court? Because whenever the playing field is even, and the rules are public, and the goals are clear, and the referees are fair, and the score is transparent, we can make it. If there's any doubt, there's a replay, because there's a determination for a game to have a just process and a just outcome. Those rules that make athletics work don't apply beyond the athletic field. And so fighting for a just society, equal protection under the law, equal opportunity, those are very radical ideas. One of those radical ideas in the whole Bible is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. A 1-to-1 ratio does not sit well with aristocrats. A 1-to-1 ratio does not sit well with those who have supremacist notions of themselves and inferior notions of other people. So he's fighting for a just and balanced society. I mean, in football, if blacks had to run 12 yards for a first down because they came from a broken home, and whites had to run 8 yards because they inherited some yards, we couldn't get along there. But so long as 10 yards for all first downs, 6 runs for all touchdowns, we've learned. And so when I look at the games and I see the black and white referees and black and white players and all that, I just see the joy in people of odd political arrangements. They want a fair game. No one wants to win because because of violation, because of the bad call by a referee. Well, those same rules must apply to access to med school and law school and politics as well.
We talk about Cicero and Cicero being, you're marching on Cicero after it was your idea, wasn't it?
Well, Cicero was considered kind of the Birmingham of the Chicago community. It had been some killings there, and the reputation was very violent. And so it was the supreme test would we confront Cicero. And we met downtown with the mayor and the Archbishop Cody and all of that, Cardinal Cody. And we finally decided to not go into Cicero. We had made our point about open housing versus closed housing, but the temperature was so hot, the people marched in Cicero anyhow, in defiance, which is part of the whole uprising over open housing. Because what was happening when we were in Chicago, people marching all around the country for fair housing. People were locked in these ghettos and locked into limitations every place. After all, when we got the right to vote in open housing, you got a mayor 50 years ago this year with Mayor Richard Hatcher and Gary and Carl Stokes in Cleveland. All that comes out the same struggle. That's not Chicago, that's Gary, that's Cleveland, that's Detroit, Coleman Young, that's LA, Bradley. So the impact of these movements, the movement became like the earthquake, the aftershocks, the reverberations affected everybody everywhere from Seattle to Miami. I think another point I would like to think you should take is the ups and downs of the struggle are very distressing mentally and emotionally. I remember we were, his last birthday, we didn't realize it was his last birthday, January 15, 1968. We all met about 50 of us met down in his basement of his church. And that day was a lot of excitement in the air. It was a warm Atlanta, Georgia day. The morning around 8 o'clock, he had breakfast with his family. Came to church around 10 with the blue jeans on and sport jacket and sport shirt. And he had some whites from Appalachia with whom we had not worked before, but we were aware of their situation. Some Latinos, some Chavez group from Southwest Texas and Colorado, California. Some Native Americans, some African Americans from Deep South, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. Some Jewish allies, Al and Seen out of New York, some labor. About 50 of us met, planning a poor people's campaign. His argument was, we've got public accommodations. We have the right to vote, but we democratized in poverty. There's abounding poverty. He argued, Dr. King said, there must be a floor beneath which no person should fall. We should always have a base of access to education and health care, a decent house, wage, and education for the mind, and art for the spirits and culture. He kept that vision focused. And so that day we had that kind of meeting. And around 8 o'clock, he left home and came to church. Around 10, we met. Around 12 o'clock, Zenona Clayton came in, and Bernard Lafayette came in, and she had a cake. She said, Dr. King, you forgot it was your birthday. And we laughed, and it was January 15th. And we cut the cake, and we drank the punch. It had about 12 to 1, maybe. And then that afternoon, Al Lowenstein led a workshop on how to end the war in Vietnam. So as I argue, people who celebrate his birthday, let that week be a week of door-to-door voter registration. Let that be a season to fight for automatic voter registration. Let that be a season for activism, not just band crests and parades, but activism, because he spent his own birthday home, church, work clothes, in poverty, in the war, because he believed that the war in Vietnam, resources that was designed for the war on poverty, which he thought to be a morally virtuous movement, was going to the war in Vietnam. And the resources needed to heal at home was going to kill abroad. 3 million Vietnamese were killed. He thought that to be a moral disgrace. And so he wanted to shift. He said, let's go to Washington. We're going to Washington. If necessary, go to jail, civil disobedience, and convince this Congress to shift from war in Vietnam to war on poverty, because bombs dropped in Vietnam, resources spent there will explode in our cities. And of course, ultimately that did happen. But he spent that, and it's kind of happened, he was on a good move that day. That was January 15th. We had a meeting of ministers January 20th in Florida, the 4 ambassadors, trying to organize a plan to get this going in 25 cities simultaneously. But in April, the last week of March, I remember on a Friday night, we were preparing to have a meeting the next day. Reverend Abernathy called. He said, first of all, Dr. King called, said, I need to see you guys tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in my office. I said, Doc, we'll try to get there, but it's late. He didn't spend much time arguing the case. Reverend Abernathy said, Martin wants to see you guys. Bevel and I were in Chicago, and I think T.Y. maybe in Cincinnati and other people, different places. So reluctantly, Bevel and I, we got to the airport at 7 o'clock. I said, Dr. Abernathy, we missed the plane. We can't make it. He said, I know you're going to miss it. You're on the 7:35 Eastern. So we got the 7:35 plane. And I shall never forget that meeting because he came in a kind of somber mood. He said, for 4 days I've had a migraine headache. I thought I sat with my wife, Coretta, and then Jean and Ralph and Juanita. And I pondered, maybe I should quit now. Maybe I should stop. Maybe I've done as much as I could do. We won the Montgomery bus boycott. Broke down barriers of public transportation. We have public accommodations. We have the barbarism is behind us. We have the right to vote. Many of my friends are turning on me. Many of my Morehouse friends, my classmates. Preachers have said I can't come in their pulpits because we shouldn't be engaged in the war. I can't bifurcate my sense of justice. The war is morally wrong. I live in the world. I'm a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I live in the world, not just on one side of the town. He kind of talked. And maybe I should quit. I remember Andy saying, Dr. King, please don't talk that way. He said, Andy, be quiet. Don't say peace, peace when there is no peace. Kind of like Jeremiah. And when he said that, in a way, we got real quiet. He said, but then I thought maybe if I would fast to the point of death. My Stokes is my friend, and Rap and Floyd McKissick, we're all friends. We disagree on tactics and strategy, but we're friends. So maybe if I were near death, they would come around my bedside and we could regroup our struggle. And then as if something hit me, said, but we can go on to Washington, as we did in South Georgia. Then we go on to, it's like he preached himself out of depression, and he had been depressed. And I was taking notes because it struck me that the same 3 moves of Jesus, let this cup pass from me. And then some disciples slept. And then as he pondered, some disciples slept. And then not my will but thine be done. So Jesus goes from let this cup pass me, I think maybe I should quit, to as he prayed, disciples slept, to not my will. But the king went from maybe I should quit to maybe I should fast upon a death, to not my will but thine be done. I watched those 3 moves and we left on that note. We vigorously debated that morning what we should do tactically. Dr. King he said, but I feel so alone. That made us feel so bad. I was arguing and Bevel was arguing. If we get to Washington and the government shuts down us, what do? We have no sympathetic ears anymore in Washington. So we finally said, well, when we got through arguing, that if we go to Washington, we look at the top 50, or GM was the big company at that time, maybe if we would target a big industry like that, nobody cars, to get big industry to the table to deal with our concerns. They said, well, let's think it through. So we left on that note. It's a very anxiety-driven meeting, painful for me, frankly. Then we met in Memphis that Tuesday, I suppose. And he came, he said that the plane had been held up because they thought that he was on it and it might be a terror attack. And he sat in the room we met with some ministers that morning about what the role they should play on the garbage workers strike. And Dr. King, he came and stayed in the room most of the day and said, well, I have a headache, I don't feel like going. And we had been laughing and playing, and he and Anna were pillow fighting. It was a very fun day. He said, you know, my dad said, my dad's a slick old man. He said, Dad came out of, I think, Cornelius, Georgia, some real small Georgia town. So he came to town, and Dad had not been to college or anything, and my grandfather, A.D. Williams, in front of the church, sitting down, and he found that he befriended the pastor. He said, but it was because the pastor had a daughter, which was my mother. We laughed about that. And ultimately, they became husband and wife. He said, and I looked back to my family's history. He kind of walked through history. So later, around 5 o'clock, he said, I'm not going to the rally tonight. I don't feel like it. But Jess said, will you go? I didn't have a thought. Ralph said, no, Jesse, you ought to go. And so I think he must have asked Andy. So finally, Reverend Abernathy and I went together. So we'll go together. So we went over there. It was raining that night. And we walked in the door. Church was about 3/4 full. And the people cheered. So Ralph said, Jesse, don't think they're cheering for us, that they Maud's behind us. And so you could sense they were expecting him. So we went down the side of the church at Mason Temple Church to the back where Bishop Mason of Church of God in Christ found where his body lay. And Dr. Abernathy called him on the pay telephone, if you will. Said, Mon, come just for a few minutes. You don't have to stay long. Said they're so ready for you. And so Dr. King came, and Ralph gave a rather long introduction because he was trying to let them get himself adjusted. When he got up and gave the speech, if I could live any other time in history, he had walked through history that day on a very personal level. And I've been to mountain, I've seen the promised land. That was in the context of, and then we had no idea what he may have felt about the forces closing in on him. I'm not fearing any man. It's a big statement when you reflect 50 years later. I'm not fearing. It's like I know they're trying to kill me. I know they're out for me. Because when I took on the Vietnam War, I was taking on our government in wartime. I was taking on angry people and misguided people in wartime. We were walking to the airport one day in O'Hare in Chicago. And I remember 4 sailors, 2 white and 2 black, came. Hey, Dr. King, how you doing? And one guy said, Dr. King, why are you against us? And he stopped. It's almost as if he teared up. So we told Bernard, we kissed and explained, I'm not against you. I think you should be in college, not in Vietnam killing somebody. So I'm for you. I want you to live, not kill and be killed. He stopped and talked with him. He sensed that kind of moving in on him. And so I do not know what he felt that we didn't know, except I'm not fearing any man. I've seen the glory and the coming of the Lord. And I've been to the mountaintop, and he in turn, we embraced, because I was sitting right behind him, Dr. Abernathy. So that was that night, you know. And the next day, we met some more, figuring out what we were going to do, because we had a good night the night before, finally. And I remember Reverend Billy Kyles and Jose and I were in the room with him, and some local gang groups who had interfered with the march the week before. They came by the room, wanted him to raise them some money in New York. He said, I can't get you a grant unless you have a plan. I don't have any money. And they got boisterous, and Jose and I said, it's time for you guys to go. You know, we had that kind of understanding with them, and they had to go. So we set up with Dr. Reverend Billy Kyles and his wife Gwen to have dinner at their home that night. I remember I brought a band down from Chicago, Ben Branch and Wayne Bennett in the group, David McCullough. We were over in the carousel singing. We were going to sing tonight at the rally. The week before, Dr. King had been to Chicago at the breadbasket meeting. And he'd heard Ben Branch play Praise the Lord on the saxophone. He'd never heard that before. It was a beautiful rendition. So I was coming across the courtyard, and Dr. King, he's about an hour late, as he was typically. He said, Jesse, you ready to go? I said, you're done. He said, you don't even have on a tie. So I said, Dr. King, a prerequisite for eating another tie is an appetite. He said, you're crazy. We laughed. And he said to Ben, how you doing? And Ben said, Dr. King, he played my favorite song tonight, Praise the Lord, because he'd heard him play it 2 weeks before. And he said, stop! And then he raised up, the bullet hit him right here. It severed his tie. I heard someone, I think Bevel was saying, get low, because whoever was shooting, their spray bullets, they could have shot several of us. And I was running toward the steps. And there's a picture of Andy Young and pointing. The pointing is that he was knocked against the wall. And the police were coming from that way with the guns. We said the shooter came from that way, not this way. That's what that picture was all about. And I remember getting down, and By the time Reverend Abernathy came out the room, he said, Martin, but he was non-responsive. So I got up and went and called Mrs. King, because I was living next door to them. And I called by his bedside. I had that phone. She said, hello, Jesse, how you doing? I said, Miss King, I said, it was a long 10 steps to take from where he was to that phone. Dr. King been shot. I think he's been shot in the shoulder, but I think you should come. I really couldn't say what I saw. It was like too much to say. Like, I just couldn't say that. Couldn't say that. And she said, I'll come. And maybe a few minutes later, AP called, said he was dead. And that's when a new dimension of our struggle took off. We determined at that time, really led by Reverend Abernathy and Joe Lowry's leadership, took on another dimension. We would not let one bullet kill a movement. We would turn the pain into power. And a lot of stuff happened post his assassination. That was burning in the streets. But there also was a burning desire of people to do something, people who had never come next to hear him speak, who had never been to a King rally. The burning in the hearts was hotter than the burning in the streets, frankly. And out of that came the Gary Convention. Out of that came elections all over the country. Out of that came a whole new dimension of politics in our country. In many ways, from the balcony in Memphis, back at the White House, 40 years in the wilderness. It was a non-stop movement. Lots of stuff happened. I call it 40 years in the wilderness because it's so analogous to what happened with Moses in 40 years in the wilderness. For 40 years, the leader killed, breadbasket, and marching and changing rules for the Democratic Convention in 72, running for offices we'd never run for before and winning. A high degree of consciousness from color to Negro to Black power to African American. Our minds were getting freed up, and the success of the 84, 88 campaigns with the broad base of coalition building, and the young had become a mayor, and Walter Fontrell become a congressman in the South in Washington. One could just see us kind of swelling up, and so by 08. I remember standing in Grant Park across from Johnson Publishing, where Mr. John Johnson used to raise money for Dr. King or give Dr. King support. Where in 68 there had been the riots and tear gas. And in that same park, Barack Obama is announced president. Boy, tears came from everywhere to meet my eyes because it was the moment and the memories. The moment was that we won the big one. We had won the big one. We had won the big one. And I knew Barack would represent us well because he's so smart and so able, and one could see evidence of that. But what also made me weep, I wish Dr. King, Meg Evers, Mrs. Parks, really, certainly Fannie Lou Hamer could have been there for a moment to see the fruit of their labors. Certainly Fannie Lou Hamer, Meg Evers, because it was their night, really. And then the people who couldn't get there, some of whom were injured or dead, a guy named Cotton Reeder and James Orange and others who had been injured along the way, who may be unable to come to Chicago, couldn't get the big standing spots, couldn't get this. The common people made that right to vote possible. The right to vote was the crown jewel of our struggle. And that's why it's always on the attack, because the right to vote is the crown jewel of democracy. And there's the attempts to minimize, undercut it. Even today, the protected right to vote in 6 states has been undermined tremendously by this administration. And one of the most anti-forces was led by Sessions, who said the right to vote wasn't an imposition on the South, it was intrusion. And he could not wait, he and the Roberts Court, to in fact remove the protections from the South. All that stuff came and post came. Here we are today. We're in a different place. But the roots of all this is Martin Luther King Jr.
You've already talked about the assassination. You went home to Chicago right afterwards, and you talk about the rioting and what your feelings.
We had a substantial movement of Operation Breadbasket in Chicago. Aftermath of the '66 movement. Here for the first time, blacks built chain store, construction guys, companies. We began to build churches for the first time. Built a stronger black middle class. We began to leverage corporations to invest in the black community. We had stores on the weekends to put their monies in the black banks. Over the weekend monies accrues. And so, with a strong movement here. And he had been here 2 weeks before. And my family was here. So when the shot took place, when he came back from the funeral home, the Atlanta group went home. They lived in Atlanta. I lived in Chicago. I came home to be with my family and our organization. And so I woke up the next morning. Chuck Purser was standing over me, sent the Purser to come by the house. I was still landing with my clothes on. I went down to City Hall. I was so angry because the same folks that were so hostile toward him, some of the ministers and political leaders, the data forces that say he should get out of town, he had no place in Chicago. They were having the drapes, the purple and black drapes, and I was mad as hell. So you guys sit here as hypocrites. I was trying to control my anguish with discipline. It was hard to do, and I left that afternoon and went back to Atlanta, but I came home first. But there were explosions all over the country. We were trying to turn garbage into energy if you can discipline it. So our point was, don't just burn up where you live. There's some of the areas that were burned out are still burned out these many years later. Turn your anger into votes. You should turn your anger into boycotts. Turn your anger into opening school doors or to close. Because if you spend more than you have, you get in debt. You vote less than you have, that's a formula for suicide. If you spend less than you have and vote all you can, that's a formula for power. So how do we discipline our power and make something happen that's big here? And we began to finance our own campaigns. I mean, the basic money for Harold Washington's campaign came from the black business community in Chicago. The first monies of Barack Obama came from the King group of 66 and 60, 72, the Al Johnson, Boutte, John Rogers' parents, that the King group put the first money even for President Barack Obama. So there's a continuity between open housing marches and Chicago 66 and the White House in 08. There's an unbroken line of, and I think much of that has been left in the dark because many writers only put a footnote to his work in Chicago. I might add, but for the record, there's a book written by Dr. Deppie. If you've not read, you should read the book, Martin Deppie. I'll give you a copy of it today because for some reason or other, they want to say, well, Montgomery was a success, and Birmingham's success, and Selma's success, Chicago, he got had by Daley. It's not true. In Chicago, we laid the groundwork to redefine the urban structure. Chicago is so big, you can have a stadium full of people at Soldier Field, White Sox and Cubs Park, be full. You don't miss anybody you know. This is Chicago. This is not Selma or Birmingham or Atlanta. This is Chicago. And so we had to figure our way out how to navigate through this urban situation and build coalitions. That's why I say that the weapons are, you have to have the right to vote. You have to right use of your dollars, your coalitions, act and be most morally right. All that stuff has to come together to make something happen. So Dr. King's, the Barack victory is a King victory. Dr. King's side of history. And we who were in that struggle would rightly be called the Joshua generation, because Joshua came out of Moses' army. He was the Moses of our time. And so out of that comes Andy Young, who becomes Congress and goes to the UN. Out of that, Walter Fonseca comes out, who helps to organize Washington. Out of that, and then out of the aftermath, the Rainbow Coalition comes Barack Obama. So the king is the Moses of our situation. That's King, that's Joshua, and then there's here we are today, facing a stiff resistance, a reaction to our progress. Unfortunately, one built upon fear, not built upon hope. But Dr. King warned us of this. He said, you'll have these forward movements forward, and then fear will set in, and then reaction will set in. You plant two seeds in the ground of equal strength, and you water them both. Would you put a wall between them? One will grow tall with multiples of fruit, one will be short and stunted. It does not mean the smaller is less than, the other is more than. It's something called photosynthesis. One that had the light could flourish. And whites often have the light, and they flourish, not because they're better, because they have photosynthesis. Or to put it another way, you have a wall between you, and on the other side of the wall is ignorance, fear, hatred, and violence. So you put a wall and we can see each other. We become teammates on the football field. We become teammates in the army. We must become teammates in voting for health care, in jobs and justice. That's why we choose bridges over walls.
So coming up to Chicago, how was Mayor Daley a different kind of opponent for King compared to the Bull Connors, and how was that tactic different?
A Bull Connor had a solid white Confederate base. It was a white-black society. Mayor Daley had many more African Americans on his plantation. He had ministers who were intimidated if they spoke out against him on Sunday morning because of some policy. There was some precinct captain in the audience who would report them to the building commission. They challenged the churches on Monday morning. Churches were under intimidation. He controlled a political structure which had black leadership in there as committeemen and aldermen. They're all on if you want to become a judge, you have to go through Mayor Daley. Police officer promotion had to go through Mayor Daley, so he had a very controlled situation. So the first time we ran into stiff black resistance, where a group of blacks, ministers, had a press conference and said, we don't need Dr. King to be here. Another guy had a press on the west side, said Dr. King should go to hell. Made all the nightly news. Here you had a group of political leaders over in one of the churches, big press conference on why Dr. King was not needed in Chicago. We never met that in Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma before. That was different. So we had to distinguish between who was trapped in that machinery. So we had to free those in the machine to get them freed too. I should never forget one Saturday afternoon, since we kind of divided who was in the machine, who was freed, who was like Gus Savages over here, and someone else over there. And Hal Washington sent for me. He was staying on at that time South Parkway, which is now King Drive. We spent most of that Saturday afternoon explaining why he was in the machine, but not of it. His father was a protester, Harold Washington's father. He learned how it worked, how he presented the machinery, and his own way why he was fighting. Harold became someone who understood it, in it, didn't like it. Harold was a different kind of creature. He knew enough of it. Kind of like Moses. Moses understood the system in Egypt because he grew up in it, and yet he didn't like it. Harold was kind of that guy with that duality of consciousness. And so at some point in time, out of the emerges Harold Washington, who knows what makes the machine click and how to stop it from clicking. One Sunday morning, one Friday, should I say, Dorothy, wait a minute, Dorothy, yeah, Dorothy Tillman and Marion Stamps and Lou Palmer were at the open housing meeting, and they were arrested, beaten and arrested. We went down to get them freed, and then we still kind of become exhausted on like what to do next. This is such a big complex situation, Chicago, New York, LA. And I was on the radio program that Sunday morning on BMX. Someone called and said, why don't you guys just boycott Chicago Fest? That's just Jane Burns' coronation. You've done a lot to get her elected, and she's defied us, turned her back on us. I wanted to say to him, it's easy for you to say call a boycott. It's hard to do. Yeah, we're going to have free hot dogs and beer and Cokes. Stevie Wonder's coming for free because the citizens are underwritten the cost of the concert. So my mind said no, but my movement consciousness said, but if you have the faith, it can happen. So it's really faith versus mind. And so I couldn't put the person out there saying, you don't understand, so I'll get back to you next week. So that Sunday, I asked Reverend Evans, and he said, go for it. And Joe Gardner and the Verse Group and Leon Finney. And so by Wednesday, we had a meeting at this building and said enough is enough. We just kind of west side, south side, and then north side. And we started the boycott. And so everybody had a different assignment. My assignment was to get the artists whom I worked with in Expo not to cross our picket line. We called Stevie. Stevie wouldn't cross the picket line. So they sued him. Stevie took the hit of the suit. But when he wouldn't cross the picket line, every day a different artist wouldn't cross the picket line. So after 10 days, this thing had momentum. Harold came by one day. Harold said, this is successful. I'm on my way back to Washington. I'm not going to run for mayor because I have a good job, and I like my job at Washington. I'm not going to run. I said, Harold, you have to. You're the one with the right set of credentials. So Harold said, we went to have the meeting. Harold said, well, 2 or 3 things. One, if I were to run, you have to put on 50,000 new voters, raise at least $250,000, not promise to put on the table. I have to build a coalition. This is not just a black city. I have to build a coalition. So we take you up on that. In the wake of 10 days of a successful boycott of Chicago Fest, very successful, a lot of press coverage every day, media coverage all day. The day the boycott was successful, the day the boycott successful. So we had a meeting, and they put on 400,000 new voters and raised $500,000 led by Mr. Ed Gardner and people of that ilk. And so Harold kind of was trapped in his own rhetoric, so to speak. But it was really part of his consciousness, frankly, for a long time.
Right.
And out of that, Harold won. But that too comes out of the same Chicago consciousness, because had we not had the Expo, and had we not known Steve and the artists, that couldn't have happened. Had we not had the presence of mind, it couldn't have happened. So all that stuff, in the wilderness years, that stuff like that happened.
I want to go back to the media response to King in Chicago when the movement moved up north. It seemed like the first time that King was getting from northern news outlets and 60 Minutes, and he was getting criticism. Can you talk about that and how did he feel about that?
Well, the media is strongly cultural, and the media didn't believe that we had the capacity to take on the Daley machinery. They had fallen prey to that, and after all, the Daley machinery, quote unquote, delivered Kennedy in 1960. The fact is, under Congressman Dawson and that district in Chicago of blacks, that's what turned the key for Kennedy. But Daley had the overall arch, and he was the guy, and it couldn't happen. And when they didn't see an instant struggle, these big cities, a lot of instant gratification. But in Montgomery is a single issue bus boycott that cripples the city's transportation. Birmingham, it cripples the downtown area, and you have the tumultuous uprising, and we win because the barbarism and the degradation of dogs biting people, and the whole world saw it. And Selma, another one-horse town, so to speak. But Chicago is a big, complex situation. And so as we finally got off the ground with breadbasket and the community in slums and the school struggle and open housing, and then we met with Daley and met with Cardinal Cody and said, well, you didn't win anything in Chicago. We knew it was a long distance run in Chicago. And the fact is, the reason why we are just looking at a post-African-American president is because of 1966. You could not have had 08 had you not had 68 in Memphis and 71 in Gary, had you not had all that stuff, it was a kind of nonstop struggle from the one balcony to another balcony, the balcony in Memphis, the balcony in the White House.
I was just thinking, I'd read that the Chicago Tribune said that the King, you and King threatening to march on Cicero was, they called it blackmail by martyrdom. How did you feel that the media, that not just Chicago, but the northern media was being unfair?
Well, you see, the sense that they knew if we marched, as we marched, and whites were erupting in ignorant, volatile violence, that we were winning, though we were getting hit. That nonviolence had the power to pull the worst fever out of them and show our moral strength. We were winning, though losing. They had the stick, we had the Bible. They had the politics, we had the morality of our cause. They felt by going into Cicero, it would just be, whites would just go berserk. But we would win, though bloody. Well, they saw that. And no, we didn't mind dying for life. We didn't mind going to jail for life. We put forth our courage and bodies on the line. Our bodies were like living sacrifices. And so they said it was like we didn't want martyrdom, we wanted open housing. And we finally got open housing and fair housing because of that.
I want to talk a little bit about after the movement, after the Chicago marches, coming back, the SCLC, Andrew Young talks about how the SCLC started to disintegrate a little bit and sort of internal strains on it. What were those pressures like on SCLC?
Every time one of us would leave the core organization and go to another position, we call it expanding our movement, not disintegrating. And at one time, was head of the King Foundation, Human Relations Council in Atlanta, and SCLC de facto executive director, and ran for Congress and won. So SCLC was going to Congress. Had Walter von Troy and the Young in the Congress. So we were there, arguing that case. I stayed in Chicago, and every time we win a victory over some corporate lockout, that was the SCLC was there. When Bernard Lafayette was going his journeys into nonviolent teaching and C.T. Vivian. So the core group expanded, we didn't leave, we expanded. And there were children out of the immediate household. In other words, Maxine Waters was de facto on the staff, but she was in California. Reverend H.H. Brookins in California, Reverend Tom Kilgore in California. All these, the seed sown grew great harvests around the country, indeed around the world. So not only did we harvest fruits in America, but we led the drive to get Mandela out of South Africa. Same spirit. We led the drive to get Aristide back to Haiti. So the movement, when I went to Syria to get Lieutenant Robert Goodman and the Americans out of Iraq and Cuba, that was not the king. We were still believing that we had the moral authority. Our struggle captured the imagination of people around the world.
Right. No, I was thinking about also how when King came out against the war, they talk about how a lot of the SCLC funding, outside funding, sort of dried up. And did that cause any pressures on you and your organization?
Tremendous pressures. That's why our movement never accepted the regular salary competition for monies. We were making like $37.50 a week, without insurance. Somebody asked me one time, Jess, how did you at age 25, 26 get so close to Dr. King so quickly? And that were you, and that was Bevel, and that was just a handful of you guys. So, well, if you want to work for $50 a week or less with no insurance, on call to go to jail, you might get shot. There was no long line waiting to get in that line. It was a short line of people willing to pay the price. And Dr. King felt it was kind of like the coefficient of expansion. Once we came out, we swelled up. We would not go back. We would not go back. And So it really was the blood of the martyrs that redeemed us. It was unearned suffering that was redemptive. It really was the nameless, faceless people. I remind people on the Sunday that the march took place in Selma, Alabama. It was John Lewis and Hosea who were known from their civil rights work. Mrs. Boynton, who really invited Dr. King to come to Selma. The people, the nameless, faceless masses began to swell up and believe that no stick could stop them, that no dog biting could stop them, no grave could hold their body down. We began to believe that, and by the power of that faith, we changed the course of the country.
I want to talk about the meeting at Early House. Taylor Branch talks about it being a retreat to figure out what the next moves might be, and people talked about how you would just, in terms of arguing about the fight for either Operation Breadbasket or Vietnam hunger, what the next moves were.
Well, the thing about those Early House type strategy sessions, we would go to Penn Center once a year in Frogmore, South Carolina, and think through what's next. We had developed the audacity to believe we could change cities and change laws. We believe we had the power. The folks who got the right to vote didn't have the right to vote. Folk got open housing couldn't live in open housing. We had values beyond our situation. The people who made open housing don't live in country club hills. You know, those who got the right to vote, for the most part, didn't go to Congress and the Senate. They made it possible for others to. We were knocking down doors and creating space and building bridges. We were construction workers. We rebuilt the South.
And about Memphis, you talked about that meeting when you had when he called you back into Memphis after can you go back a little bit to like how King and as the staff reacted to the violence of the first march?
We felt the first march that the gang group on the back of the march was a setup. It was a very successful march in terms of putting focus on the garbage workers. But 2 or 3 people in there disgust and anger threw rocks in some windows, and all the press covered the rocks and not the garbage workers. Dr. King, there's another case why violence does not work, because violence sucks the oxygen out the tank. The focus on how accurate or inaccurate the rocks were, but not focus on garbage workers and collective bargaining. And so, but we knew that was a plan to get attention by them. And it could have been even paid provocateurs, we were not sure. But we took that, so Dr. King can't control his troops. It's not true. The ministers and the garbage workers were marching lockstep with Dr. King. The rock throwers were coming from another angle. So the whole thing about putting it, he can't control his troops. The fact is, our troops were growing, and our sense of focus was growing. We went back into Memphis again, determined to have another march. And that's what the rally in Mason Temple was the night before, was all about that.
You talk about how frustrated he was at that point in his life, and you talk. There's that incident where he was in his frustration. He kind of cussed you out a little bit. He was a little short with you.
Wouldn't say cuss. It was we were arguing in that meeting. Bevel kept saying, I kept saying, Dr. King, if we go to Washington, and the White House closes the doors, where is the stick? So if we go to Washington and the White House says no and the Congress says no, where do we go? Do we go back home? There was no answer to that, really. I suppose we go to Washington and organize a massive boycott. That came out of that conversation. And while Bevel and I were arguing back and forth on the same page, it was frustrating to him. He said, well, Jesse, that's all right. You'll be leading one day. You'll understand one day. He left. We were being insensitive to the state of his mind and pain at the time. He said, well, come on. So that was on Saturday. On Tuesday, we were all in Memphis. There was no falling out. It was just an argument in the staff meeting about what do we do. And so in the speech it makes he referred to me in the speech. He says, and we also have put money in Tri-State Bank, and we also have development, and we also, what's that company, Jesse, Coca-Cola, Carnation, Wonder Bread. That was, in fact, one of the tactics that was being used. That came out of the Saturday morning meeting. So put in perspective, he was frustrated. He was full of pain. And I understand that pain now. As he said, I lived to see it. Sometimes you can be, you in the staff meeting, your mind is in many other places, and staff be arguing about stuff that's mundane compared to, our arguments were comparatively mundane. We were doing the best we could do with what we had. We just didn't know any better.
Did you notice a big difference between the king you met when you began in Selma and that king at the end?
Well, he had more attacks on his person, classmates. I know Martin shouldn't be doing this. When he took the position against the Vietnam War, it was all of the war machinery that came at him, Pentagon type, but civil rights leadership, he don't know what he's doing. They began to talk to the press, on and off the press. Many of the churches closed doors. Don't come in my church talking that war stuff. I mean, going against the war was counterculture. Right now we speak freely of wars because with today's technology, there are no more foreigners. You look at your gadget in real time. You're looking at South Africa and Australia and New York in real time. Dr. King never saw a cell phone. Today, if you and I catch a plane, one going to synagogue, one going to LA, we get there by the same time. Our world was so different at that time, so much. I remember my parents talking about these foreigners who work with them, these foreigners, and they can carry buckets on their heads and don't drop them. They're from Jamaica, our way, but there are no more foreigners. And so in that sense, Dr. King was expanding our world. And so we began to think we had the right to fight to free Mandela. That was our world. I went down to Peoria, Illinois a few weeks ago trying to get a guy who'd been in jail 47 years, apparently innocent. And the press said, why are you down here? You in Peoria? I said, well, we could fight for Mandela in Pretoria. We can fight for Cleve, Heidelberg, and Peoria. We're world citizens. So fighting for world citizens among people who've adjusted to their own little spot is quite audacious.
Can you, is there a memory of Dr. King when you think about it that makes you smile and sort of some personal sort of interactions, non-political, just sort of human things about him that?
I remember staying in his house one night, and he stayed in the community amongst the people. And next morning we had to get up, and Ms. King fixed a quick breakfast. It was early in the morning. And we had to get to the airport in about 15 minutes. That's before he had these security guards. And he's a NASCAR driver. I thought he would not make it to the airport. He could drive. he was a driver. We laughed, and he'd get to pull the car in front of the airport, and the sky caps come get the car. We run the airport and get the plane. I mean, he was that, One Sunday morning, he asked me to preach in his congregation. Before his congregation, that's before I was even licensed to preach. And I always teased, and the church was just packed to come to hear him speak. And he said, now this morning, one of my sons in the ministry will speak to us this morning. And Zenona Clayton said, she had come all the way from California to hear him speak. And I was getting up to speak that morning in Ebenezer. So he kept giving us opportunities to grow. And so much of my relationship with him, frankly, he gave me shoulders to grow on. And in my mind, I make certain moves now, and he's a frame of reference. If I go to South Africa, if I go to try to get some captives free, if I confront corporate America in a certain way, if I'm TV arguing sometime, I will sublimate my anger, my anguish with discipline, because I think he would have thought that way. So he's in many ways in my heart, but he's also very much in my head. And I learned to read what he read. He read Love, Power, and Justice by Paul Tillich. His PhD was in systematic theology. He read Ronald Niebuhr, Nature and Destiny of Man. And so I stay fairly close to the books he read. Now, of course, I wish this generation would read Where Do We Go From Here? I wish they would read The Courage to Be. I wish they would read and understand Ronald Niebuhr's Nature and Destiny of Man. I wish they would become more acquainted with his book of sermons. I mean, he speaks to this generation clearly, as if he's in yesterday's morning paper. He speaks to us clearly. His strategies, his philosophy, his worldview remain real today.
And what would you say finally to people that missed that, who obviously most people are too young to have marched in Selma, to have marched in Chicago. The work we have to do today, what's the work that we need to do today?
Those who live today are those who watch a Sunday football game. They miss the process from Monday to Sunday, the practice, the preparation. I hear some saying we are the Joshua generation. That's not accurate. Joshua came out of Moses' army and Moses died. Those who worked with him, Joshua won the Battle of Jericho. And he was the minority report in the spies who spied out the land. And Joshua gained his strength under Moses, and he took it. This generation is the post-Joshua, not post-King generation. But they see the fruits of the labor, the right to vote, the right to play athletics on the big stage every Saturday and Sunday afternoon, the right to be flight attendants, the right to be pilots, even to be checkout clerks at the airport. All that is post 66. It's post public accommodation. It's post the right to vote. I remember when Hatcher and Stokes became mayors of cities, they were national stars. It was such a new deal. When Bradley became mayor of L.A., now you've got a U.S. Senator from California. You've had the mayor, the longest running state rep in California was Willie Brown. So things we now take for granted, in my lifetime it happened. And so much of it was attributed to Dr. King's vision. Unity, we speak of unity, but if you have 10,000 folks marching in unity, a one-eyed person is in charge if they're blind. And the blind say that one-eyed person is in charge. He had vision. Sometimes the unity thing failed because there was competing forces, but the vision of the power of nonviolence, the power of love, the power of redemption, the power of reconciliation, the power of preparation. Dr. King went to Prince High School at 15, finished college at 19, seminary degree at 22, PhD at 26. The power of preparation and to be mostly morally right. If you have no weapons and no money, just to be morally right is like a light in darkness. And he, in his movements for change, he always carved out the moral high ground. And that's what frustrated the enemy. This is what they talked about we want to be martyrs in Cicero. They knew that in the rightness of our cause, even death became a platform for the resurrection. He survived the crucifixion. Now we live in the King resurrection. The crucifixion took place in Memphis. And one thing perhaps we do too much, we took him back to Atlanta. Atlanta was Bethlehem. That's where he was born. But Calvary is the redemption. Jesus did not choose to be born in Bethlehem. He chose to go to Calvary. The King did not choose to be born in Atlanta. He chose to go to Memphis. And what is Memphis except the Delta of Arkansas and Mississippi, the poorest Americans in Appalachia? His Calvary was in the pit of Appalachian whites in Arkansas and Mississippi Delta blacks. And so just as we celebrate his birthplace in Atlanta, Memphis must take on new meaning. As a Christian, we're not saved by Bethlehem, we're saved by Calvary. And the resurrection comes beyond Calvary. In some sense, it is Memphis, how we handle the poor of Memphis and Delta of Arkansas and Appalachian whites, how we handle that valley right there determines the power of the resurrection. That's the new American possibility.